Well, I think with our first album, yes. now we have a bar, you know? Yeah. And so the challenge for the next one is going to be, how do we, take it to the next level? It's music that makes you think, right? Because a lot of the songs that you hear today, you hear it and it goes in one ear and your brain does a little dance and you're like, oh, that's kind of fun. And then you forget about it.
What is something you would like to see change within music?
Better writing. If all your content doesn't mean anything, or it's so deeply guised in metaphor, it just doesn't matter anymore.
I think the most common reaction we've gotten is, wow, you guys are actually really good.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Light the World podcast. I'm your host, LT World. And what you just listened to before this introduction, instead of my music, what you heard was the trailer for the governor's interview that's coming out Thursday this week. So look forward to that. It'll be really exciting. And I really enjoyed the interview, and I think you guys will too. So look forward to that on 4/28/2022. Now, if you're new to this podcast, what we do on this channel is we look at cultural issues and different topics like that, and we look at both sides of an issue and try to see which ones make the most sense, and we also look at the background and history of a topic like feminism or critical race theory. And so that's what we do on this channel. We analyze culture and we try to understand it better. So if that sounds interesting to you, definitely subscribe, check it out on social media, and you can follow me on Instagram and Twitter, and you can also check out my website at ltworld.info. Now, without further ado, let's jump into today's episode. So today we're talking about critical race theory, CRT. Yeah, so CRT is a very hot topic. It's been in the news a lot lately, and a lot of governors have been voted on as of recent for the topic. The topic is very popular because people want to be taught in schools, people don't want to be taught in schools. Some people say it's not taught in schools. Some people say it's just in the colleges. Whatever it may be, this is a hot topic, and I thought it'd be cool to cover it and at least go through it and see, does this theory even make sense, and what is it all about? So let's kind of look at both sides of the issue and dig into it. So if you remember from last episode, we talked a little bit about the history of CRT, how it got started. We talked a little bit about the history of racism in America, and kind of just looked at the background of this topic. And so today we're going to look over the three main tenets that I mentioned last episode. If you didn't see last episode, definitely check it out. But we're going to look over those three tenets and kind of look at them from both sides of the issue. So those three tenets for review are: first, racism is a central and permanent and normal part of U.S. society. Second, the second premise of CRT resides in its commitment to the centrality of experiential knowledge as detailed through narrative. And the third premise of CRT challenges dominant claims of race neutrality, equal opportunity, objectivity, colorblindness, and merit. Therefore, being race neutral or colorblind is not an effective means to counter racism. So those are the three main tenets, and we're going to look at each one and kind of the arguments for all three. So, without further ado, let's jump into it. So, tenet 1: U.S. society, in particular, is racist. The racism is an central and permanent and normal part of the U.S. society. That's tenet 1, and we're looking at the side that supports that claim. So, first of all, something that people will always point out is statistics. We'll jump into statistics second, but that is normally what people will do. They'll jump into statistics and anecdotal evidence. So, that's normally what people will use to support this tenet. But also there's a couple other just theories and theoreticals that people will support. So, for instance, Schelling's discrimination model, which was an economist who proposed a certain set of model for discrimination and segregation, use this discrimination model to explain how racism can impact it can impact further results down the road, even after something may not be quote unquote racist anymore. Society may no longer be racist, and we'll talk a little bit more about it during I think it's either tenet 2 or tenet 3. Yeah, tenet 3. We talk a little bit more about it again. So there's this idea that if a society is racist and segregates or has some sort of level of bias towards race, that it'll lead to segregation and that if people eventually change or not, they're less racist, they'll still stay segregated. So there's this idea of this discrimination model, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in 10 2 or 3, but I do want to bring it up here because there is this idea that if something was racist, if a society was racist in the past, it'll most likely have consequences in the future. So that's just kind of the basis of that. And then also, people will look at things like CLS. So we talked a little bit about CLS last episode, critical legal studies. And the study, and as it goes, it basically says laws support biases in democracies, especially um, law support the bias in democracy. So whatever people vote in, that's what's going to become the laws within a democracy. And CLS says since people will vote based on their biases, people are going to vote against the interests of minority groups. So the majority is always going to vote against the minority, and that's what's going to get passed, and therefore it's going to perpetuate some form of discrimination. So that kind of makes sense. I mean, you would see that definitely during the 1900s era, where you see like Jim Crow laws and things like that getting passed, definitely was a reflection of the bias. You definitely see the sort of governors and the sort of politicians that were in place then, representing their people, were voted in by these biased, racist people or states or whatever you want to say. So there's definitely a aspect to that, and they'll say that this continues even now today, that the laws that get passed are supported by bias. But most, as I said before, normally what people do when it comes to this topic, whether or not America is racist, is they look at statistics. So let's look at a bunch of statistics and analyze them. So I'm trying to pull from reliable sources. So I'm going to try to give you most of where I'm getting most of these from, and then go from there. So according to a variety of news articles, there's different ones that said this: black men are 2.5 times more likely to be shot by police. Harvard research shows 3 times. So, but anywhere from 2.5 to 3 times is sort of the range of how more likely black men are to be shot by police. And according to Pew Research, you have they show how the races make income. So what is the differences in income? So within the 90th percentile of the economy, within the socioeconomic statuses, in the 90th percentile, or one of the highest percentiles, white people make 117,000 on average, or the median, I should say. And then the black people make 80,502. You have Hispanics making 76,847, and then you have Asians making 133,000 roughly. So obviously, as you can see, there's a big gap between black and Hispanics and Asians and whites. And then you see so in the middle, then the middle bracket, the middle of the pack, you have whites making about 47,958. You have black people making 31,000. You have Hispanics making 30,000, and then you have Asians making 51,000. Again, same sort of breakdown where we see Asians making the most, white people making the second most, and then black people making the third most, and then Hispanics making the fourth most. And there's a big difference between black people and white people and Hispanics and Asians and so forth. So there's this big gap there going on here. And then in the 10th percentile, the bottom of the bracket, the poorest of the poor in America, you have 15,000 for white people, 12,000 for Asians, 8,000 for black people, and 9,000 for Hispanics. So this is the only place where Hispanics are making more than black people, and the only place where Asians are making less than white people. But still, as you can see, it's still that white and Asian people are making more on average than blacks and Hispanics. And a lot of times people will use both of these to say that the reason why black men are 2.5 times more likely is due to systematic racism. Things have been leveraged against them by society, or cops are inclined to believe that black people are more inclined to crime due to the past racism, and due to the fact that majority of people in prison tend to be of color or minority groups relative to the proportion of their population size. And so a lot of these statistics will be used to say the reason why these things are the way they are is because systematic racism. Same thing with even the income levels. People will say that due to the fact that people were inclined to believe that blacks were stupid, or that Hispanics were illegal immigrants, and that idea that people of color aren't as smart or aren't as good at things, or even then they would say that's implicit bias, and that's reflected through pay. People pay people in minority groups less because of that. You also have the idea that the system in general just built against them. So a lot of black people, due to past history with redlining and other things like that, they now are in economic disadvantages situations because they don't have as much wealth. They're not in the best geography areas for schooling and education, and therefore it's reflected again within the stats. And here's a few more to continue to drive the point home. So studies show that for roughly 60 years, the income gap between race hasn't significantly changed. So a lot of people would say that if there were significant changes from, let's just say, the 60s to now, following the civil rights movement, you should see a decrease in that gap. But there hasn't really been a major decrease in the average income between the races. Now, black people are making more now than they used to. Same with white people, same with Asians, same with Hispanics. But the gap between them hasn't really dropped. They've been increasing at the same rate, roughly, since the 60s. And then you also have this. You also have New York Times, and they also presented some data showing that the Great Migration, redlining, still has continuous effect to this day. Specifically, they say that even though the income gap hasn't changed between black people and white people and Hispanics and Asians and so forth, that the wealth gap has changed a lot because wealth continues to accumulate and continues to build on top of itself. And since people of color traditionally in the past weren't able to collect wealth and weren't able to build up wealth, now that they have less wealth, now they're more economically disadvantaged due to racism. And so there's a lot. Those are kind of the main points, main statistics that you'll see thrown around in regard to systematic racism. The idea that black people or people of color are more likely to get shot by police, more likely to get arrested, more likely to get harassed. They are more likely to make less money, more likely not to get as good education, so forth and so on. And there's a lot to take in consideration here. So if we would, as we saw in the last couple episodes, there's a reason. There's historical reasons for this, and there is some sort of backdrop for this. So you do have the idea that a lot of property values were decreased or weren't as profitable or valuable once a family of color moved in. So you would have the whole redlining thing, where in the 60s, up until the 60s or 70s era, you would have redlining where a person of color would move into a home, and then suddenly mortgaging companies and housing companies stuff that would decrease the value of that home because a minority group lived there. Or you would also have things like Jim Crow laws from just the 50s era or so on, where black people were not able to get the best jobs, where they were left out of schools and they got worse schooling and education, and therefore there's not as much wealth within those families to begin with to be passed down to future generations, so forth and so on. And even within the span of, let's just say, 50 years since the 60s or so, or 70s era, it'll still take a while for these generations to build up wealth. It'll still take a while for people of color to break out of these bad geography zones or to overcome some of these systematic things that have been built up from the past. And so there is something to be said about the whole idea that racism plays a part into why overall, if you see across the country, these different varieties in income levels, discrimination, and also if within the police force, which is the one that I would say draws the most attention from people in regard to outroar. So like a lot of the Black Lives Matter riots in the 2000s, 2020 era, was driven by the George Floyd shooting. So a lot of times you see the whole police thing draws the most attention because it's more violent, it's more bloody, and it gets the news all riled up. But we'll also take a look at that a little bit to understand it better. But that is kind of some of the stats that people will use to support the idea that the United States is systematically racist. You can see it through the numbers. You can see it by how black people are treated by the police, and that it's just ugly and unfair and so on. However, obviously there's counterpoints to this. So for instance, we have the fact that correlation and causation are different, as we talked about in past episodes with critical theory or things like that. There's this idea that just because there seems to be some sort of correlation between race and police shootings or race and income levels, there's not always necessarily a direct causation. There can be multiple factors that cause it. Racism may be one of them, but it may not be the only one. And the fact that we hyper focus on that one may not be entirely accurate. So take, for instance, the idea that a lot of urban areas tend to, relative to expenses, make less money than rural areas. Rural areas tend to be more wealthy. They tend to make more money on average relative to their expenses. Obviously, people in cities make more gross income, but after you take away expenses and taxes and stuff, they normally make less than people in rural areas because it's just more expensive to live there in general. So minorities tend to live, there's a lot more minorities in cities than there are in rural areas, which would play a factor into why they're making less money on average compared to other races or compared to other people. And that's just one factor in the whole bunch of factors that plays into the whole income gap thing. Also, and I'll show you a little bit more about this statistically speaking as well. You also have the idea that more minority groups, percentage-wise, there's a higher percentage of minorities in cities than there are in rural areas, and there tends to be more crime, more police shootings, and more activity and violence within cities than there are in rural areas simply because of population density. And therefore, again, you're going to see there's going to be a higher probability for deaths to minorities for that reason. And that's just another factor due to geography plays a factor into it. Now, you could say that they're living there because of past issues, and that may be true. But as of present, it's not solely driven just by racism. It's not that necessarily cops are looking for minority groups or so forth and so on. So there's many factors to take into account when we look at some of these statistics. So correlation doesn't always equate directly to causation, and even if it has some level of causation, it may not be the only causer for an issue or a statistic. That's something at least to keep in mind whenever you hear statistics being used for any position, even for even from some of these other stats I'll show in regard to the counterpoint to Tenet 1, people who support it. I want you to also to look into these stats and kind of think about them and understand that, again, there's normally a lot of factors that play into these issues, and stats can only speak so much into an issue, and we got to understand them a little bit deeper. But so always keep in mind that correlation doesn't always equate to causation, but also keep in mind that people will only tell you the stats they want you to hear. So most of the stats that I've mentioned so far, these for the pro side of Tenet 1, I've heard before, actually. I've heard in classes at college, I've heard classes at high school, I've heard on news or on podcasts, stuff like that. A lot of them I've heard before, and they've been thrown around a lot. Now, some of the ones I'm going to be listing off here, I wouldn't have known unless I did some digging, and I did some digging, so that's why I know some of these other stats I'm going to deliver to you. So let's first take into consideration something from Pew Research. I want to take so Pew Research talked about the income gaps between the races. They also had an interesting point to be made about, and this goes back to our whole thing about correlation and causation. Even though we say correlation between Hispanics making the least amount of money in America, Hispanics, their race, is correlated to the lowest income level in America. But their race may not be the direct cause of that. And here's a little tidbit to explain kind of what Pew Research says plays a big part into their income difference. So Hispanic immigrants, this is a direct quote, Hispanic immigrants, many of whom were unauthorized, accounted for 50% of the growth in the Hispanic adult population in our sample from 1970 to 2016. The Hispanic immigrant population tilts to the lower end of the education and income distributions. In 2015, 47% of foreign-born Hispanics aged 25 and older had not graduated from high school, compared with 13% of Americans overall. And only 11% of Hispanic immigrants had attained at least a bachelor's degree, compared with 31% of Americans overall. The influx of lower-skill, lower-income immigrants likely exerted a drag on the measured growth in income for Hispanics. So, what Pew Research is saying here is that a lot of low-educated, low-skill labor from illegal immigration or just traditional immigration from Mexico, from the South, into the United States played a big part in why their income levels are lower than they probably would be if you would cut out that low-skill labor coming in from the South. So that's something to take into consideration when we talk about, for instance, why Hispanics are making a lot less comparatively to whites. That is something to consider. Immigration plays a big part into that because of the population size is being oversaturated or flooded with low-skill labor due to these immigration policies or due to people just moving into masses with low-skill labor from the South into America. That's something to keep into consideration when we talk about stats. Again, looking at what is the actual causation to these correlations. So that is just one example of what I was talking about earlier. But I also wanted to jump into some other stats and talk about them to help explain a little bit more about why sometimes it can be really one-sided and people don't know the whole full story. So there are normally a lot of people will talk about how black men. There's a lot of black men who are shot by police. Now, it shouldn't be shocking to know that statistically, more white people are shot by police than black people or minority groups are, simply because there's just more of them. Therefore, there are more of them. But that's not normally the issue. The only issue is that proportional to population size, there's a drastic difference. And well, part of this argument goes to the fact that a lot of people argue that a lot of black men who are shot are unarmed, even though when it comes to white people being shot unarmed, there's actually not that much of a difference between the number of black people and the number of white people who are shot unarmed. I mean, in 2020, you had over 11 white people within just like less than half a year who were shot unarmed. So again, but you didn't hear about any of those stories because again, the race of the person who was shot wasn't convenient for a story or wouldn't drive some sort of hysteria to get the clicks. Another study, National Academy of Sciences study done in 2019, showed no evidence of anti-black and anti-Hispanic disparities across police shootings, and white officers are not more likely to shoot minorities. So National Academy of Science did a study as well in 2019, and they had very little evidence of this whole discrimination in police shootings. They didn't think it was statistically significant, and they showed the data, but you didn't hear about the study because it was counter to what is traditionally understood. Similarly, a Harvard economist, Roland G. Fry Jr., agrees that there isn't any statistical significance to suggest that minorities are gunned down at an unusual rate by white officers. So again, this Harvard economist, you probably never heard of him, probably never heard about this study or the statistical significance because it isn't popular. It doesn't drive clicks or doesn't make money. Here's some more data, and this is going back to the idea that since the theory goes that since there's only about, I think the population size for black people in America is like 13 to 15%, something like that, but they make up well over that percentage-wise for people in prison and people shot by police and so forth, that relative to their population size, they seem to be shot up or put imprisoned a lot more relative to white people's population size. So in theory, prison should be like 50% white, 30% black, 10% Hispanic, 5% Asian, based on population size, and that's how it should be in a fair society, or it should be reflected at least close to that in a fair society. But it's not like that. It's more like 50% black, 20% Hispanic, 30% white, and something like that. It seems to be more like that. So therefore, since proportionally black people or minority groups tend to be more in trouble with the law, it must be a problem with the law, not with those people, because it must be systematically racist. And that's oftentimes how they support Tenet 1. But if we follow the similar logic, we could argue some different points. So for instance, based on Washington Post data, which is where a lot of people will pull data for this whole black people being shot disproportionately to white people, 96% of people killed by police are men. Using a similar logic used when looking at police shootings, that since higher percentage of police shootings involve black people per their population is a sign of racism, then we can similarly assume that police are systematically sexist against men. So 96% of people killed by police in the United States, on average, are men. But no one makes a claim that police are leveraged against men systematically, that the system is against men in general, because that's way disproportionate. It should be 50-50, men and women, but it's not. But there is no one screaming that the system is sexist, because it's not. That's not actually how the logic should work. It should be based on individual crime and individual circumstances call for certain things. And you can also see this with age. If you look at data in regard to the type of people who are arrested, age-wise, if you look at the distribution across the states, it doesn't match up with people in prison. I think the largest percentage of people in prison is I think around 40 years old or so, like that, but they make up not insignificant, but a small amount of the population, but they make up a large amount of the people in jail. So again, by age, no one's saying that police are ageist either. I'm just making the point that statistically, if we're going to follow a similar logic, we should be consistent and not just pick and choose what is convenient for a point. There's also a lot of fuss in regard to equal opportunity. So people may be racist against people of color and just assume they're not as intelligent or something. Therefore, there was a lot of studies done, or a lot of people who proposed that employers, when seeing a name that sounded like a minority group, would overlook it just because it was a minority sounding name. However, there doesn't seem to be much evidence for that. So people with minority sounding names and white sounding names have equal opportunity, according to the Chicago Tribune study. So the Chicago Tribune pulled a study, or they in a story put a study into their story showing that it's not true. Actually, people in minority groups and white people have equal opportunity when it comes to job applications and job opportunities. Many more black people are getting educated, going to college, and entering the workforce, but overrepresent majors that are service-oriented and traditionally lower-paying jobs, attributing to the continuing wealth gap, and this is according to PBS. So this is kind of to the point of the 60 years. For 60 years now, the gap of income and wealth and so forth hasn't changed much, or has gotten worse between white people and black people, between Asians and Hispanics, and so forth and so on. However, according to PBS and according to some other studies, this can be largely caused by education reasons. So a lot more black people are getting educated, getting education, are going to college. But however, proportional to their population size, actually, a lot of people in minority groups are entering into service-oriented fields, teaching fields, and fields that are traditionally lower paying than like STEM fields or medical fields, for whatever reason, for cultural reasons, maybe the way they grew up or what they were taught, or for academic reasons, whatever it may be, they tend to be entering into lower paying fields. Therefore, that would affect their income gap between white people, who tend to dominate more in STEM fields and so forth and so on. So again, that's just another potential cause for the wealth gap, which isn't racist in nature. It could just be a result of people's personal choice. And this is also the following data is also to defend the idea that, again, causation and correlation are two different things. According to Census Bureau, if people live in a city, regardless of race, people are more likely to be poor. Rural areas are primarily white, 78.2% of rural population. Urban areas are more diverse, white only making up 57.3% of the population. And crime rates are higher in urban areas than rural areas. So geography plays a part into income, and also violence, and also into crime in general. So that can affect how people behave. This is not to say, again, that due to, like, for instance, the Great Migration and redlining, that impacted how minority groups would have moved or where they would live, the geography-wise. This also racism played a part in, for instance, a lot of black people would have moved to factories because factories would have given them job quicker than like southern plantation owners would, or some other industries would. Therefore, they moved to the cities where the factories were. There is racism plays a definite part into this income thing, but it's not the only driven cause. There's multiple causes, multiple factors, and so to say the whole system is completely racist, or say the whole system's rigged against people in minority groups, isn't completely fair. And there's some tension there and some argument, and there's multiple factors that play a part in it, and we should address all those factors, or at least do what we can about some of these factors that we can do something about, and create incentives that may not necessarily involve tearing down the system or restructuring. But that's just some food for thought in regard to Tenet 1. I don't think there's enough evidence to say that everything is driven by race and driven by racism. I think that plays a small part into it, but I think there's many other factors that play into it that we should take into consideration based on data. But that's Tenet 1. That's kind of the both sides of the issue. Looked at a lot of stats, a lot of facts. Now let's look a little bit more into Tenet 2, which is an interesting one. So Tenet 2, as a reminder, the second premise of CRT resides in its commitment to the centrality of experiential knowledge as detailed through narrative. So there's this idea that narrative is very important to CRT, that we need to listen to the stories of black people, we need to listen to the stories of Hispanics, we need to listen to the stories of LGBT, that's for gender theory, but we need to listen to the stories of minority groups and really take what they say with heavy weight. Their experience is carries with it more knowledge and more insight than, let's just say, a white person who tries to defend them or even counter them. Their story is less significant, less interesting, less weighty, because they're not of a certain oppressed group. And so therefore experience carries with it a certain set of knowledge, which there is some sort of intuitional sense to this. I mean, it's hard to be empathetic if you don't know what someone's experiencing. So since I'm not black, for me to say I understand what it's like to be black would be ridiculous because I don't. So therefore, I would need to hear someone's story about what it was like growing up black in a certain neighborhood, because I wouldn't have any context for that since I wasn't black growing up in a certain neighborhood. So there is some level of common sense to this of like, I can't be empathetic or really fully understand unless I hear your story. However, in some cases, this isn't exactly their point. Sometimes it's more of like, we need to focus on the history from the eyes of minority groups, or we need to only listen to black people have special insight into racism, and white people specifically are the ones who will always have racist undertones, and they won't know it unless black people correct them. That's kind of more of sometimes how this can be taken in its extremes, less than just being empathetic. So there's this idea that everything carries with some special weight just because you don't understand what someone experiences. And then you also have it be told by history is told by the victor. So if you would look at history books, people who come out on top are the ones who write history. They're the ones who tell the historical narrative. They're the ones who link together the different events. And we need to start flipping things on its head and start looking at history from a different perspective. Again, that does make sense intuitionally, like this whole idea that we should be able to look at everyone's perspective, because history is very diverse, and history is not only just there isn't just like the people at the top who drive history. There's a lot of people and peasants and things that drive history. There's a lot of things that drive history. So it is important to get a diverse view on history. And counter story is just important to challenge common narratives. So a lot of times people will hear the same story over and over again. They'll never hear a counter story or a different perspective on the story, and it's important for people to do that. And so therefore, experiential knowledge and stories and narrative have a big part in how people understand and perceive the world. And people should perceive the world more from a minority standpoint or oppressed standpoint, because their voices have been suppressed for so long and overlooked for so long. And it carries with it special knowledge and so forth and so on. And this will even, and then again, as I said, this in the extremes, this will be people saying white people can't say anything that's true in regard to racism, and they can't have any point on racism, and they can't say anything about racism. There are some radicals who say that, and that only people of color or only minority groups can say anything about racism, and you must listen to them because they have special insight. Those are like your really, really extreme versions, but you have people in the middle or moderates as well. And that's kind of how they defend their position. It's when I looked at a lot of papers or a lot of arguments for critical race theory, they really focused on the first tenet. For the second and third tenet, there's a little bit less of, I guess a deep philosophical response is more of like this whole intuitional thing of, we just need to understand people. We need to be more empathetic. That type of thing for tenet 2. And I'll give you an example of what this looks like. So let's just take the George Floyd example, for instance. So let me explain the scenario for anyone who may have forgot what that was like or what happened, and we'll jump into a little bit what this means to us in regard to the second tenet. So George Floyd was a 46-year-old black man who allegedly tried to pass off a fake $20 bill. Derek Chauvin, the cop, showed up on the scene, and George Floyd appeared not to be in his right mind. He seemed to be on drugs, and he reportedly resisted arrest. And according to camera footage and stuff, he was very erratic, sort of, pushing around a little bit, but nothing too crazy, I guess you could say. No weapon or anything like that. After a short back and forth, Chauvin pins George Floyd on the ground, handcuffs him, and using his leg/knee, he presses against George's neck for several minutes as George Floyd keeps saying, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe, I can't breathe." He eventually experiences complications and dies. Derek Chauvin did get arrested, eventually get charged, and is serving time in jail. I'm not sure if he's still in jail or not. I don't know. But I know this did go to trial then. And people took this narrative in 2020 specifically and really said this is a reflection of the American system overall, and we need to listen to more black voices. And you saw the whole protests and riots, people putting their fists in the air saying Black Lives Matter, or people saying hear their stories, listen to black voices, stuff like that. And this story, George Floyd's story, was supposed to represent America as a whole. It was supposed to be a narrative to reflect the America's position on racism and how it's systematically racist. This was the narrative, and it looks really ugly. It's a really ugly story, and no one likes to see this. This was awful. But it was applied a wide scale, and whether or not that was fair, that's hard to say. And this kind of leads into our the counter side to this. experience doesn't equate to meta truth. So just because someone has a personal experience that was bad doesn't mean it applies broadly. And so, for instance, let's take the George Floyd instance for example. There may be racist cops within wherever that geography area or within that city that George Floyd was living in. I think it was Dallas area. I think it was Dallas, but I'm not sure where that took place. But let's just say, for instance, in that area specifically, there's really bad cops. They're racist. That's bad. That may not apply directly to every state in the United States altogether. There may be certain cities where actually it's the opposite. They're racist against white people. I don't know. There could be this idea of geographies having different sort of cops. It's really hard to take one anecdotal piece of story and apply it broadly to a bunch. And it's even hard to do this with a handful of stories. I know that people might say, well, we'll look at Tariq Rice or look at George Floyd. You can look at the King story. I think that was 2000. You could also look at some other Brown. I forget exactly their names, but there's a bunch of different cases that occurred that were on the news over the past couple years or past few years. But the number that appear big time on the TV, at least, are a small handful compared to like 350 million people in the United States with millions upon millions of different geographies, locations, cities, and towns and bureaus. To apply a story that broadly to a whole country from one or two or a handful of incidents or a dozen incidents is really, 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 really difficult to make a whole narrative. And that doesn't make a meta truth for a whole nation. So experience doesn't equate to meta truth. And then also, again, as we kind of talked about, the application of these stories isn't always fair. So I'm going to quote someone first. I'm going to also look into an example of what I mean later, kind of like I did with George Floyd. So this is a quote from, I think his name's Daniel Sabatnik, a professor of law at Turo Law Center. And he's using a story about dolls' prices. This idea that sometimes people make comments that like black dolls are cheaper than white dolls. This is due to systematic racism or something like that. And this is his quote. Finally, let's suppose that black dolls regularly sold for $3.99, but for $5.99, Shirley Williams would not. My bad. Finally, let's suppose that black dolls regularly sold not for $3.99, but for $5.99 and increased in value. Shirley Williams, the person he's referring to, who was defending CRT, would not conclude that the prices reflect the skyrocketing status of black people. So this person Williams was using certain stories and certain examples to say this is a reflection broadly of America and racism and where black people stand. But his point was, whenever these things flip or whenever you can point a counter story out, a lot of times these defenders of CRT won't acknowledge it or say that's different because, well, it just is for some odd reason, even though it follows a similar pattern. You also have Regina Austin, professor of law at Pennsylvania University, who has this quote: "Our jurisprudence should create enough static to interfere with the transmission of the dominant ideology and jam the messages that reduce our indignation, limit our activism, misdirect our energies, and otherwise make us the reproducers of our own subordination." And this whole idea was that ideologies are oppressive, and if one takes over another, then a new oppressed group arises. So if you do let's just say you do apply a story or experience meta, or you take it broadly across a whole nation, and then you say, do this story, this is how people are treated. People accept that narrative and say, yes, this group is oppressed or has been oppressed for years. If you create a new oppressed group, eventually that oppressed group, and if you only listen to their meta story, we only take the insight of minority groups, eventually their ideology is going to become the dominant ideology with time. And with time, it's going to form and become dominant. And guess what? You're going to have a new oppressed group, which is the group that used to be the oppressors. And now are we to expect then to have to listen to the new oppressed group, which was the old ideology, or a new ideology that's just different than the dominant ideology that was defended because it was an oppressed group earlier, because now they lost their special insight since they're no longer an oppressed group. I don't think that really follows consistently. I don't think that really makes much sense. We could say that we should listen to all stories and all stories have equal value, and that we should take all into consideration and be holistic in our approach. But to say someone has special insight and someone else doesn't, and that the ones that do have special insight should have the dominant ideology down the road, or should be listened to the most, or only be the ones to be listened to, will just lead to problems down the road, and will continually create this cycle of oppressed and oppressive And I don't think that makes much sense, and I don't think we should go for that. And also, reliance on emotions is not logic, and reliance on anecdotal evidence is very limited and narrow. And that's kind of what I was talking about with the whole experience doesn't equate to meta truth. But you can also do a very similar thing that, again, as I kind of talked about with the doll example, a lot of times people who defend CRT or who don't defend CRT, people who defend CRT will really raise up certain stories and narratives because they have special insight. But you could say the same exact story, which is a little different factor, in this case race, and they would ignore it, saying, well, since the person was black, it couldn't be this. And it's no longer, they don't even give it recognition. So let's take an example like Tony Timpa. Tony Timpa was, I'm going to pull this from Fault Lines, which is a book that talks about CRT quite a bit. And I'm going to directly quote it and just kind of let it speak for itself. So, have you heard of Tony Timpa? Like Floyd, Timpa wailed and pleaded for help more than 30 times as officers pinned his shoulders, knees, and neck to the ground, reported on the Dallas Morning News in August 2016. Timpa, a 32-year-old schizophrenic, called the police himself, saying he was off his meds and needed help. When police arrived, Timpa had already been handcuffed by a security guard. 3 Dallas Police Department officers restrained Timpa for nearly 14 minutes as he pleaded, "You're going to kill me, you're going to kill me, you're going to kill me." Eventually, Timpa went limp, in which time the officers mocked him and made jokes, and in the end, when the paramedics finally came and put Timpa's flaccid body on the stretcher, one officer said, "I hope we didn't kill him," but they had. And also, I don't believe let's just see. The Dallas Morning News first reported Timpa's death in a 2017 investigation that showed police refused to say how a man who had called 911 for help ended up dead. The officers were still on duty and no disciplinary action had been taken at that time. And in fact, the DBT refused to release body cam footage that was only done after 3 years of legal battle. So very similar to the George Floyd incident where you have someone pleading for their life. In this case, Tony Timpa called for help himself, but the reason why you don't know much about Tony Timpa, the reason why this has become a national story, the reason why this isn't popular is because Tony Timpa was white. He was white, and he was unjustly killed by police after calling 911 himself, saying that he was off his meds, and he was brutally mocked and then killed by police. But no one knows about him because he was white. It's a tragic story, just like George Floyd's story. It's very tragic, but yet it's ignored and it's downplayed because it doesn't have special insight, which is unjust. And I think we should be more fair in our presentation of stories and narratives, and it should be more holistic and not just focusing on one or the other. I'm not saying we shouldn't hear George Floyd stories or Tony Timpa stories. I say we should hear both. But that's neither here nor there. So let's move on to tenet 3, and this is the last point, and this one's going to be the shortest point, I believe. So tenet 3 is the third premise of CRT challenges dominant claims of race neutrality, equal opportunity, and objectivity, colorblindness, and merit. So let's pull out the Schelling's discrimination model that I was referring to earlier. So Schelling's discrimination model claims that if a group of people were segregated or have some level of bias, it'll lead to segregation. But let's just say those people become race neutral. Eventually, over time, there won't be any change in segregation because people will be comfortable where they're at and they'll remain where they're at, and therefore there will be no diversity within America. There will still be segregation, and therefore systematic oppression can still continue because those geographies that people stay in, the minority groups stay in, will still be less funded because there won't be any moving or shifting around, and the people where the money is will just stay there, and therefore there will be no shifting around, and they'll get more ahead in life. That's the whole Schelling's discrimination model, which again makes sense in regards to the fact that, yeah, 100% neutrality wouldn't incline anyone to move. You would need to have, as Schelling put it, a want or a drive or desire for diversity. You would need to have a desire for it and seek it out to get rid of segregation, and that makes sense. And also, the people who defend it say that people who say they're colorblind allows them to ignore issues. So if you say, well, I don't recognize race, or I don't recognize racism, or I'm not racist, or I'm race neutral, you're unable to detect all the problems mentioned in tenet 1. You're not able to see systematic oppression, you're not able to recognize implicit bias because you're not looking for it, because you claim to be not racist. And since you're not looking for it, you won't notice it, and since you're not noticing it, you are a part of the problem. You need to be actively anti-racist. You need to be actively seeking diversity, because otherwise, discrimination is just going to keep going on. And that's those two things are the main kind of defenses for Tenet 3. And again, as I said, Tenet 2 and Tenet 3, a lot of times they don't focus as much on that. They focus a lot on Tenet 1 when they talk about CRT. Some opposition to this is that Tenet 3 will just lead to reverse racism. So you have things like affirmative action with colleges, where certain colleges will look to get so many people of color or minority groups, and therefore will pass up applications that may be more meet more of the merits, but since they're not a certain race or since they're not a certain minority group, they'll get booted out or won't get accepted because they need to meet a certain quota of people with even who are lesser meet lesser requirements but fit a certain bill, minority bill, that need to get in. So you have things like affirmative action like that, or you have things with job applications where they might be like, well, I want to have a certain amount of black people in my job, so I'm going to turn down white people simply because they're white because I want diversity. So people will say this can result in reverse racism, which it can, if depending how you apply it. And also, as I mentioned earlier, there's not full agreement upon Tenet 1 or whether or not the prevailing issues in regard to race are directly correlated just to race, or if other factors play into it that aren't race related. And also, in comment to Schelling's discrimination model, the problem I have with it, and the major problem that economists have with it in general when it comes to segregation, is that it takes only into account one aspect, which is desire for diversity. There's other reasons why people move and shift around. Economic incentives. So people of minority groups may grow up, recognize that they're in a bad spot, and have an economic incentive to move to another place, which would lead to more diversity in other places. You would have people also who see business opportunities, or government can also fund certain areas, which then boosts economic incentives for people of maybe white people or Asian people to move into a certain area that's predominantly dominated by black people, so forth and so on. There's multiple factors that play into why people move, why people shift around, and why people go. I don't think the desire for diversity may play a part into it. A desire for segregation may play a part into it, but that's not the only factor of why people move. There's economic incentives, there's just personal circumstances, there's governmental circumstances. There's many things that play into it. I think they only take into account one factor. If race was the only reason why people moved or segregated, sure, Schelling's discrimination model would make absolute sense. But since it's not the only factor, I think it's not as powerful or as potent as people would like to think it is. But that is just a little bit of a criticism for the Schelling's discrimination model. Overall, I think that there is a level of truth that we should desire some level of diversity. Although I think the type of diversity we should be looking for is more in thought rather than in necessarily skin color and stuff like that. We should be looking for different perspectives, different point of views, different religions, different things like that to help strengthen our understanding of the world and build us up. And that would be better. That would be a more productive or a better sort of diversity than necessarily looking for race diversity in of itself. Everyone should have equal opportunity to succeed. Everyone should have. There should be eliminate barriers to success. But people have personal choice. People have personal decision making to do, and that also plays a part into certain things we see. Systems can impact how people are incentivized, but people still have personal choice. And that does still play a part into everything we talk about up until this point. And one last thing is solution is another thing that people will bring up from both sides. What is the solution to this issue? A lot of times, people who defend CRT will say this is a problem, but they'll say that you can't fix it. Some people will make the claim you can't fix it. Others will say it'll take years to fix. Some people don't give a direct solution. So what is the solution to the issue? If it's not color blindness, if it's not neutrality, if it's not just creating open opportunities for people, what is the solution? And if it's some form of reverse racism, that's just creating a new issue down the road. So it's just something. This is a broad overview of the topic. You can definitely do some research. I'm going to drop a lot of links and a lot of resources for you to look at. You can look at a bunch of different books and from different perspectives. So some books you can look at as like White Fragility. You can look at 8 Years in Power. You can look at books like that. Those are supporters of CRT. You can also look at counterpoints to CRT. You have Fault Lines by Voddie Baucham, which is a counterpoint to CRT. And you'll have other links that I'll drop down below that you can look at. So do some research yourself, do some digging yourself. This is just a broad overview and a quick look into CRT and the different arguments and different points. So yeah, thank you for listening. If you enjoyed what you heard, definitely subscribe, definitely follow along on Instagram or Twitter, check out my website, ltworld.info, and I hope to see you guys come in here again. So, now, friends, without further ado, go out there and light the world.